I asked you this years and years and years ago, but it's so long ago I can't quite remember the answer. But I think there was a time when there was a cluster of languages that you were finding a bit recalcitrant, a bit hard to sort of fit in. And those were some, at least some, of the Aboriginal languages in Australia.
Well, there was one of the early appointments in our department, Kenneth Hale, who became a very close friend. He died a couple of years ago. He was one of the founders of Australian linguistics. In fact, a lot of the people working here now are students of his, and so on. And he did a lot of work with Aboriginal languages of Australia, with Native American languages, later others, and some of them seemed to have properties which looked quite different from familiar Western languages. Actually, I should say so did Japanese at the time. It looked quite different. One of the basic differences appeared to be, and right through the 1970s, this was widely assumed, that they were kind of they had free word order, basically.
Yeah.
Kind of like Latin.
Yeah.
You could put words in all sorts of orders, whereas a language like English, it's got to be pretty rigid. So it was assumed that there's a property, it's called a parameter, technically a distinction among languages, whether they're word order free or fairly rigid word order. Over the years, there's been a lot of chipping away at that. It now appears, first it was shown for Japanese and others that it just wasn't true, that they had basically the same structures, a few differences, but not these. Finally, that came to be shown for every language that's known, including the ones that appeared to have extremely free word order. One of the main ones was Walbury, one of the languages that Ken studied. But more intensive study showed that if you looked more closely, they had pretty much the same principles. There are differences, but small differences. In fact, it's kind of interesting that the same development has taken place within biology. So if you go back to the 1950s, in the study of language, it was pretty widely assumed that languages can, I'm quoting virtually, that languages can differ from one another arbitrarily, almost without limit, and that when you approach a new language, you should approach it without any assumptions about what the structure of language should be. That's sometimes called the Boasian tradition, after the great anthropologist Franz Boas. Biology, the same was assumed. It was assumed that organisms can vary from one another virtually without limit, and they develop the way they do just by the accidents of natural selection over long periods. Both of these ideas are pretty much, well, in biology it's gone. By now it's so far gone that there are even proposals taken seriously, even if not totally accepted, that there may be a universal genome, that all complex or multicellular organisms developed roughly 500 million years ago, Cambrian explosion, and they're all fundamentally the same, from bacteria to humans. They have slight difference. What's been found is conservation of genetic mechanisms, which is extremely deep. And the way it was put back in the 1970s by one of the great figures who initiated this development, François Jacob, who was that great French biologist, Nobel laureate, that, as he put it, the difference between, say, an elephant and a fly is just slight differences in the arrangement of regulatory mechanisms.
Everyone can see that, no.
Yeah, that's right. And this went in parallel with similar developments in linguistics, not unrelated, incidentally. We all knew each other, and there was influences.
But what an exhilarating time it must have been for you.
It's quite exciting, yeah. By now, what seemed very exotic in the early 50s for many, not for everyone by any means, but for at least people in a pretty wide sector of study of mind, seems kind of routine. Yeah.
Are the studies in linguistics plateauing, or are they accelerating? Is there still a hell of a lot more to know?
Well, it's like the other sciences. The more you learn, the more you know that you don't understand anything. In fact, that's very characteristic of the sciences. Take a look at this is kind of like early modern science, which is instructive. So if you go back to, say, Galileo, there was a general assumption in the sciences that they sort of basically understood everything. So take something which we now know is complex, but was then considered very simple. Suppose I'm holding a ball, let's say, and I suppose I'm holding a cup with boiling water in it, and it's covered. If I take the cover off the cup, the steam rises. If I let go of the cup falls. So why does the cup fall but the steam rises? Well, there was an answer that was accepted for several millennia, the Aristotelian answer. They're going to their natural place. So that explains it. Game over. So we understand everything.
Well, that makes sense.
Galileo and others of early 17th century were willing to be puzzled by it. The ability to be puzzled by simple things is quite a significant kind of intellectual achievement. And Galileo questioned, he's the famous one, others too, why that happens. And as soon as he began to question it, it turned out not only that it's not trivial, but that one's intuitions about it are all wrong. So the sort of intuition is if you have a heavy ball and a big ball and a small ball, the big one will drop faster. Okay, it turned out not to be true. They drop at the same rate. It turned out that rate of fall didn't depend on distance, and so on and so forth. But out of that puzzlement comes modern science. And as you proceed in modern science, the more you learn, the bigger the gaps are. It's kind of like mountain climbing. You climb a hill, you think you've made it to the top. When you get there, you see there's a bigger peak you didn't know about.
Over the years, I've lost count of the scientists who have sat where you're sitting and who have confidently told me that the theory of everything was just moments away. Yeah. That the equation was going to go up on that blackboard at any minute.
Well, physics, for example, has some slight problems, like finding 90% of the universe. Yes. They haven't found it yet. Yes. That's what the CERN accelerators for, trying to find some particle that's supposed to be there, but if it isn't there, there's a big mystery about 90% of the mass energy in the universe.
I've had the pleasure of reading your speech for the Sydney Peace Prize while under embargo, and needless to say, I thoroughly enjoyed it. And let me now do a segue into this whole issue of your political life. You make the point powerfully and endlessly that we voice great moral indignation about other people's atrocities, but we are blind to our own.
That's pretty much a cultural universal, I think. When you look back over history, you find many examples of this, but very little of a willingness to sort of look into the mirror. Almost every culture I know of has a fringe of people who do it, and they're usually persecuted. So one of them drank the hemlock in classical Greece. Go to the biblical prophets, the same period roughly. The prophets are what we would call dissident intellectuals, and they were very badly treated. One of them, the famous case, Elijah, was denounced by the evil king, the epitome of evil in the Bible, King Ahab, as proper translation should be a hater of Israel. It's usually translated troubler of Israel, because he was criticizing the evil king, so he must hate Israel. The evil king, like all totalitarians, associated himself with the culture of the society, the people, and so on. And if you take a look through the biblical record, the people we honor, who were honored centuries later as prophets, were treated extremely badly. After all, one was crucified, and that's a kind of historical pattern that replicates itself through the ages. So there's typically some fringe of critics who say, look, we should look at ourselves. Read the prophets. They were saying we should pay attention to our crimes. It was put in theological terms. God's going to punish us for violating his laws, but we're the ones who are sinning.
But whenever you raise this issue, you are immediately categorized as anti-American. Mind you, of course, that's the classic technique, isn't it?
Anti-American's an interesting concept. Notice that it's used almost only for the United States. So if someone in Italy, let's say, condemns Berlusconi, he's not called anti-Italian. The very concept is a totalitarian concept. It means that if you're criticizing, say, state policies, you must be opposed to the society, the culture, the tradition, and so on, which is a typical totalitarian concept. In the old Soviet Union, for example, dissidents were condemned as what was called anti-Soviet. In the Brazilian military dictatorship, they were anti-Brazilian, And it's kind of striking that I think the United States is about the only society where the term is used.
And primarily, of course, used by the right.
I wouldn't call them totalitarian, but are reflecting a totalitarian conception that if you're a critic of the policies of the state, you must hate the country.
But you're an even-handed critic of the United States. You've never been a great enthusiast for the rabid right of the Republican Party, but you're no great fan, for example, of Obama's.
No. First of all, I think the two parties barely differ. They're just famous sociologist C. Wright Mills back in the 1950s.
What a great writer! Yeah,
two branches of the business party.
Yeah,
but if you go to a journalism school in the United States, you're taught a concept of objectivity. Objectivity means you tell the truth about debates going on within the Beltway, in the Washington framework. If you object to that framework, you're subjective, biased, emotional, whatever it may be. That again, I don't want to exaggerate it, but it has a totalitarian element to it.
Were you sympathetic to Ralph Nader's candidacies?
His campaigns?
Yeah, when he ran for the presidency.
I mean, I like Nader. I think he's done very interesting things, but we had a personal, sharp disagreement about this. I don't think it makes a lot of sense for an individual to set himself up and say, I'm running for president. If he was running as part of an incipient political organization which was trying to establish itself and become a voice in national affairs, say the Green Party, and he was picked as its candidate, then I think you could give some justification for it. But when it's a personal campaign, it doesn't make any sense. For one thing, it's never going to get anywhere, but it's also the wrong idea. It's not individuals going to, change the world. It's popular movements can change the world. They may yield spokespersons who may be influential or significant, but they're not gods.
What do you make of the Occupy movement?
The Occupy movement?
Yeah.
I think it's quite an exciting movement. In fact, in many ways, inspiring. There's a lot of pitfalls, a lot of problems, but it's the first organized, popular response to very significant changes that have taken place in the United States, but in fact other societies, roughly the last generation, the period of what's sometimes called neoliberal globalization, which I think has been very destructive everywhere it's been applied, the concepts, differently in different countries. But in Egypt, where the policies were applied, they led to economic growth and wealth, concentration of wealth, but very harmful to the general population, and led to a lot of resistance, a lot of militant labor action, which has finally crystallized itself in the Arab Spring. If you go to a rich society like the United States, the policies were not identical, but they're somewhat similar in character. They've been, again, there's been economic growth, but it's gone into very few pockets. And for the majority of the population, it's been something like stagnation, even decline. That's a big shift in American history. Remember, since the 18th century, the early British colonists came, it was a developing society. It was industrializing, developing. It wasn't very pretty, I should say. It meant exterminating the indigenous population, and slavery, all sorts of horrible things, conquering half of Mexico. But fact of the matter is, whatever your judgment about the methods, it was a growing, developing society. Not 100%, there are setbacks, and it was also a hopeful society. You could expect that things are going to be better for your children. That went on until the 1970s. At that point, it reversed. It's quite a significant historical
And it's
change.
not just the Occupy movement. It's also the Tea Party in a strange way.
The Tea Party movement is expressing similar. It's based on similar resentments and anger, but it's a totally incoherent movement. For one thing, it's not a real popular movement. It's actually quite small. There are a lot of sympathizers, but people are angry about everything. But their position is internally incoherent in an interesting way. The United States is a very heavily polled society. We know a lot about people's opinions. When you look at the study of attitudes, which are carefully done, polls are well done often. CBS, others, Pew.
Yeah.
And if you look at them, they're quite interesting. So there are studies of people who we think of as Tea Party adherents, people who say, get the government off my back, that kind of thing. Small government, let us alone, market. If you look just at those people and you look at their attitudes, turns out they're social democrats. Like they think, we want to get rid of the government, but what about spending on health? It should go up. Spending on education should go up. Spending on help for, say, poor women who have to take care of children, should go up. What about welfare? No, that should go down. Yeah. That's because welfare has been demonized.
Yeah.
But even on things like foreign aid, very standard attitude. This is a long time in the United States. Is we give way too much away to the undeserving and poor. Then if you ask people, to estimate what they think foreign aid is, they give an estimate which is way higher than it is. When you ask them what they think it ought to be, the answer is much higher than it actually is. Mm. And in fact, across the board, what you have is these kind of vaguely unformulated, sort of roughly social democratic attitudes connected with a doctrine that says get rid of the government and hand it all over to corporations. And they hate the corporations.
As well as the orthodox polls, like Pew, there are the greasy polls, which are run by, the likes of Fox News. And looking at those, one is astonished from this side of the Pacific at the comings and goings in the Republican sort of rat race for the nomination. And I know a couple of days ago you were very concerned, or perhaps more amused, by the prospect of Texas Governor Rick Perry getting the nomination. Now, I know he has fallen back, but isn't it funny that the Republican machine, or the organism, can produce someone as totally irrational as Perry?
Or Backman. In fact, practically the whole of the Republican debates, I don't know if you followed them.
We do.
There's like nothing in the history of parliamentary democracy that's anything like that, I think. They are totally irrational and very dangerous. I mean, there's a kind of a catechism you have to sign on to if you want to be part of that system. And some of it is not only irrational, but extremely dangerous. For example, you have to be a global warming denier. Well, that spells doom for the species.
And you've also got to deny evolution, even at this late stage. Yeah.
And there's a reason for that.
Yeah.
About roughly since for about the last 30 years, the Republicans have gradually ceased becoming a traditional political party.
What are they then?
What they are is at the core, they're just an extreme faction of the very wealthy and the corporate elite, tiny corporate elite. But the point is you have to have a mass base. You can't participate in a political system if your policies are just, enrich the super rich and then empower the super powerful. You can't go to the population that way. So they had to develop a mass base. How do you do it? They appealed to they recognized around the early 80s that there is a mass base that is based on precisely the kind of thing you're mentioning, kind of religious extremism, irrationality, fear of foreigners.
Or fear of everything.
Of
really.
everything.
Yeah,
And that base is quite large. So, for example, in the United States, I don't know what it's like here, but in the U.S., about a third of the population believes in the literal truth of every word in the Bible. That's why you get half the population not thinking the world was created a couple thousand years ago. About 2/3 of the population expects the second coming soon, and about a third expects it in their own lifetime.
You are in a much more agnostic country, Australia. We don't have these sort of manias.
I don't think any other country has it. There's been a lot of comparative studies of different...
But why America?
This goes way back. I mean, whatever the reasons are, it goes back very far. I mean, the Pilgrims, the first colonists, were religious fanatics. I mean, they were waving the holy book when they were destroying the Amalekites.
Yeah.
And then the Scotch-Irish brought similar things. Anyway, whatever the reasons may be, it perpetuated. And the Republican strategists recognized that you can appeal to that mass base and still get enough votes to put into office the people who are going to cut taxes on the rich.
No, given that fear is rampant in the American political system, and given that we prefer not to be fearful, do you fear for the future of your country in the short term?
Well, if you fear for the future of the country, you're fearing for the future of the world. So, for example, take, say, global warming again. That's not a joke. You look at the way it's presented is there are scientists who believe in global warming, then there's skeptics who say there isn't any. The scientists are like 98% and 2% of skeptics. But that picture is incorrect. There's another group of people who deny the scientific consensus. Those are scientists who say it's much too moderate. They say, look, it's a lot worse than you guys think. So, for example, just take MIT, where I am. There's a climate change group of very eminent scientists. They are convinced that the truth is much worse. Actually, a big study just came out from the University of California, which makes the same conclusion. Even the International Energy Association has recently warned we might be getting to a tipping point where there's not much you can do.
It may be too late already.
It may be, but whatever it is, it's very serious. Now, if you have a country, the most powerful and richest country in history, which says it's not happening and furthermore we're going to make it worse, the species is in trouble. The United States is not only not... Most countries, just about every country, is taking some kind of maybe halting move to do something about it. The United States is going backwards. Under the impact of this right-wing republicanism, they are now dismantling the efforts that were made by Richard Nixon. That's an indication of how the country, how the party's changed. When I say it's not a political party anymore, I mean it's developed a mass base based on fear and anger, irrationality, but and it has policies which are totally destructive, and there are no longer any moderate Republicans.
I want to ask you one final question, and then you can rest your poor voice. In the Sydney Peace Prize address, you ask the big question: can we proceed to at least limit the scourge of war? Can we?
If you look at history, it's pretty hard to believe it. I mean, that's the UN in 1945, the founding document, and we certainly haven't limited the scourge of war. I mean, there has been one success, in fact, I mention it, and that's continental Europe. Europe, for centuries, had been the most savage, brutal place in the world. You go back to the 17th century, the 30 Years' War killed maybe a third of the population of Germany, not small. The 20th century, we know. And it stopped. It stopped in 1945, so European states don't go to war with one another anymore. There's a thesis about this in the political science literature, which I'm kind of skeptical about. It's called the thesis of the democratic peace. Democracies don't fight each other. However, there's another factor which you have to consider, and I suspect is dominant. Europeans recognized by 1945 that if they play the traditional game of slaughtering each other anymore, it's all going to be over. They've developed means of destruction so extraordinary that you just can't do it anymore. Powerful states can't go to war, so you attack the weak. And since 1945, plenty of attacks on the weak and defenseless.
Congratulations on the prize, and thanks for that marathon effort. Noam Chomsky, winner of this year's Sydney Peace Prize, driving the right-wing commentary crazy, and institutional professor and professor emeritus of linguistics and philosophy at MIT. Hallowed be his name. On our next, I'll be talking to my old friend Graham Bond, who you may know better as Auntie Jack, and we'll also be looking at how modernity has affected our attitudes and approach to death. Stick around now for the news on Radio National. See you later.